Hey guys, what if I told you that behind the castles, cathedrals, and glittering courts of the Middle Ages, there was another world, one built not on splendor but on fire, smoke, and survival. Tonight, we step into that forgotten world, the kitchens of medieval Europe long before stoves, ovens, or electricity. This wasn't just about food, it was about survival, status, and faith. To understand medieval cooking is to understand how people endured harsh winters, celebrated power through feasts, and lived in rhythm with the fire that sustained them. So, before we begin, make sure to like this video and subscribe if you enjoy uncovering the hidden stories of history. And drop a comment telling me where you are and what time it is there. It is always fascinating hearing where this community listens in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, settle in, and let's journey back together into the smoky kitchens and crowded halls of the Middle Ages, where cooking without modern tools reveals the resilience, ingenuity, and flavor of a world that shaped us all. Let's set the scene. When we step back into the world of medieval Europe, we must first strip away every image of a modern kitchen. There were no stoves with dials, no ovens that clicked to life with gas, no refrigerators humming in the corner. Instead, the heart of cooking was the fire itself, the hearth. It was not simply a tool, but the axis of the household. Around it, people cooked, warmed themselves, worked, and gathered. The fire was the closest thing to a modern appliance, yet it was infinitely more. It was the very foundation of survival. In the typical peasant's dwelling, whether a timber-framed cottage in England, a wattle and daub hut in France, or a longhouse in Scandinavia, the hearth occupied pride of place. Sometimes it was in the center of the single-room dwelling, sunk into the earth and lined with stone. In other cases, it might be set against a wall, but it was always the nucleus of life. Medieval houses were often draughty and cold, with little insulation beyond thatch or mud plaster. The hearth provided not just food, but the only consistent warmth. Without chimneys in most homes until the later Middle Ages, smoke filled the room. A hole in the roof or gaps in the thatch allowed it to escape slowly, creating a permanent haze. Rafters turned black with soot. Eyes watered. Breathing was made difficult. But this inconvenience was accepted, even valued. The smoke cured meats hanging from beams, deterred insects from invading thatch, and slowed rot in the roof timbers. Families understood that smoke was not just a nuisance, but a form of preservation. One of the most important responsibilities in any household was keeping the fire alive. A fire, once extinguished, required flint, steel, and tinder to rekindle. A difficult task that could take time, particularly in damp conditions. Many households guarded embers through the night, banking them under ash so that a single breath and a fresh stick of kindling would coax flame again in the morning. In some regions, communities even shared fire. If one family's hearth went out, neighbors might offer embers or burning wood to restart it. Fire was precious, and its continuity was symbolic of the continuity of the household itself. Cooking over the hearth was both an art and a science learned by practice, intuition, and generations of observation. Unlike a controlled oven or stove, heat could not be measured with precision. A skilled cook judged the fire by sight, sound, and smell. The glowing red of embers, the crackling of kindling, the rhythm of the boil inside a pot. Tools such as iron trammels, adjustable chains or rods, allowed cauldrons to be raised and lowered. By shifting position, cooks created different heat zones on the same fire, a boiling spot, a simmering edge, and a warm corner to keep food ready. The cauldron was the most common cooking vessel, a symbol of sustenance in its own right. Families often owned only one, and it was used for stews, porridges, and boiling meat. In wealthier homes, large bronze or copper pots supplemented the iron, while poorer families made do with clay pipkins, small earthenware pots with 3 legs. These could be nestled directly among the coals, the legs lifting them just enough above the embers to heat evenly. The result was simple, practical fare. Pottages of grain and vegetables, thickened with pulses, flavored with herbs, sometimes enriched with a scrap of bacon or fish when fortune allowed. Although boiling and stewing were most common, roasting was another valued method of cooking. A spit placed over the fire allowed meat to rotate, basted in its own juices. In great houses, servants or spit boys were assigned to turn it for hours. In smaller households, roasting was a rare luxury, reserved for feast days or special occasions. Frying was possible too, using shallow pans and animal fats, such as lard or butter. Yet both methods consumed more fuel than boiling, and in a world where wood was precious, boiling remained the daily standard. Baking bread at home was almost impossible for peasants. A proper bread oven required tremendous amounts of fuel to heat and could not be fired daily without wasting wood. Instead, villages often shared communal bakehouses. Families brought their dough, each marked with a unique sign cut into the top, and the oven keeper baked them together in one firing. This system conserved resources and reinforced the communal bonds of rural life. Bread, alongside pottage, formed the backbone of sustenance. The hearth was essential, but it was also hazardous. Open flames threatened fire in houses built largely of wood and thatch. Burns were common, especially among children who played or slept near the warmth. Clothes might catch sparks. In towns, devastating fires swept through tightly packed timber homes, often beginning in kitchens. In response, some wealthier households built separate kitchens, detached from the main house, to reduce the risk. But for the majority, danger was simply part of daily life. The atmosphere of the hearth was also thick with soot. Over years, smoke layered beams and ceilings in black resin. People lived in this environment constantly, with respiratory issues likely common, though poorly documented. Despite these conditions, the hearth remained the only option for cooking. Its drawbacks were outweighed by its necessity. Beyond utility, the hearth held deep symbolic meaning. It was where families gathered to eat, tell stories, and endure the long winter nights. Its light was a rare comfort in an age without electricity, its warmth a defense against the cold that pressed constantly at thin walls. In many European traditions, the hearth was sacred, associated with protection, continuity, and even divine presence. Some cultures blessed or prayed at the hearth, recognizing it as the soul of the home. Even architecture reflected this importance. In many medieval villages, homes were built around the fire, with seating, bedding, and workspaces all radiating outward from its glow. The layout of life was dictated by proximity to heat and the ability to cook. In Northern Europe, longhouses even brought livestock under the same roof, so that human and animal heat combined. In this sense, the hearth united not only family, but also farm. To understand medieval cooking is to understand the centrality of the hearth. It demanded skill, vigilance, and endurance. It provided not only food, but heat, preservation, and meaning. It tied households together in survival and created a focal point around which social and spiritual life revolved. Without modern kitchens, medieval people relied on nothing more than wood, fire, pots, and skill, and in doing so, they built entire cultures around the flame. For the medieval world, cooking was never merely about feeding the body. It was about sustaining the household, binding the community, and mastering the unpredictable nature of fire itself. To cook without a kitchen was to live always in negotiation with the flame, to coax, control, and respect it. The hearth, smoky and perilous though it was, stood at the center of survival. If the hearth was the stage, then the tools of cooking were the actors that gave medieval food its form. To cook without modern kitchens was to rely on a small but vital collection of implements, many of which look deceptively simple to our eyes today. Yet each tool was shaped by centuries of refinement, adapted to open flames, scarcity of resources, and the rhythms of daily life. Understanding these utensils is to glimpse how meals were conceived, prepared, and shared in a world where even the most ordinary object could mean survival. The most iconic medieval cooking vessel was the cauldron. Hung from a chain above the fire or nestled among the coals, it was the workhorse of the medieval diet. Made of iron, bronze, or even copper in wealthier households, cauldrons varied in size from small personal pots to great kettles capable of feeding dozens. For peasants, owning a cauldron was essential. It was often one of the most valuable objects in the household, passed down across generations. Cauldrons lent themselves to the staple dish of the time, pottage. This slow-simmered stew of grains, pulses, vegetables, and scraps of meat was rarely emptied entirely. Instead, it was replenished day after day, with ingredients added as they became available. The cauldron thus became a living meal, evolving continuously. Beyond pottage, cauldrons were used for boiling meat, brewing ale, scalding milk, or even dyeing cloth. Their versatility made them indispensable. While metal pots were prized, they were expensive. Many poorer families relied on pipkins, small clay vessels with 3 stubby legs. These legs allowed the pot to stand among the embers without tipping, and the clay retained heat gently, ideal for slow stews or sauces. Pipkins were fragile, but they were inexpensive to replace and widely produced by potters. Earthenware also served in the form of baking dishes, jugs, and storage jars. Glazing became more common in the later Middle Ages, helping pots resist liquid absorption. Archaeological finds show pipkins scattered across medieval Europe, proving their ubiquity in humble homes. While boiling was the norm, roasting was a method of prestige. To roast required not just meat, itself a luxury, but also tools and extra fuel. Spits of iron or wood allowed meat to rotate over flames. In noble kitchens, spit-turning could become the job of a dedicated servant, often a boy who would sit for hours, cranking the mechanism to ensure even browning. Over time, ingenious devices such as counterweights or even small tread wheels powered by dogs were developed to reduce human labor. For smaller cuts, the gridiron was used, a simple iron grate set over embers. Its parallel bars left marks on meat or fish, an ancient forerunner of our modern grill. In some cases, multiple spits and gridirons could be arrayed before a massive castle fireplace, producing feasts for hundreds. Frying was not absent in the medieval kitchen. Shallow pans of iron or bronze allowed cooks to sizzle food in fat. Skillets sometimes had long handles, so they could be thrust over flames, or legs so they could balance on coals. Fats used for frying included lard, butter, or oil where olives grew. While not as common as boiling, frying was valued for flavor and texture, turning flatbreads crisp or giving meat a savory crust. Cutting tools were as essential then as now. Every household possessed knives, though the quality varied widely. The wealthy might own finely forged steel blades, while peasants relied on simpler iron ones. Knives were multi-purpose, not only for cooking but for eating, hunting, and craft. In fact, medieval diners usually carried their own knife to table. Butchery required heavier tools, cleavers for chopping through bone, axes for larger carcasses. Wood provided the cutting surface. Boards, blocks, and even plain stumps were pressed into service. Preparing food meant a constant cycle of cutting, chopping, and grinding, work done mostly by women, servants, or apprentices. Flavor in medieval food often came not from salt alone, but from herbs and spices. To unlock these flavors, cooks relied on mortars and pestles. Stone or bronze mortars allowed garlic, herbs, or imported spices like pepper and cinnamon to be ground fine. Wealthy kitchens owned large mortars capable of reducing nuts into pastes for sauces. Grain, the foundation of the medieval diet, also required grinding. While large millstones in watermills or windmills processed flour for bread, households sometimes used smaller hand querns for daily porridge or emergency use. Grinding grain by hand was laborious, but it gave families independence when mills were far or taxed heavily. Even the simplest tools carried weight in the medieval kitchen. Ladles of wood or metal stirred cauldrons and served pottage. Wooden spoons were carved in countless shapes and sizes, their handles worn smooth by years of stirring. These were often handmade, inexpensive, and personal. Families might own a bundle of spoons for both cooking and eating. Serving food could involve large trenchers, flat rounds of stale bread used as edible plates. Later, wooden platters and pewter dishes became more common. But at its heart, service remained simple. A ladle into the pot, a spoonful into the trencher, and a loaf of bread, broken and shared. Though not present in every home, the bread oven was central to medieval food culture. Constructed of clay, stone, or brick, these dome-shaped ovens stored heat in their thick walls. Once the firewood inside had burned to coals and been swept out, loaves were placed on the hot floor. Peels, long-handled wooden paddles, slid the bread in and out. To identify each loaf, bakers or families scored marks on the dough before baking. Because ovens consumed so much fuel, many villages relied on communal bakehouses. Each household prepared its dough, marked it, and brought it to the oven on firing day. This practice made baking a social event as well as an economic necessity. Tools like peels, brushes, and long iron pokers were shared among the community. The tools of cooking also reflected social divisions. A peasant might own little more than a cauldron, a wooden spoon, and a knife. A merchant's household might add earthenware jugs, pipkins, and a skillet. A noble kitchen, by contrast, bristled with spits, mortars, silver platters, and specialty gear for elaborate dishes. Inventories of castles revealed kitchens stocked with dozens of cauldrons, basins, ladles, and knives, each serving a specific role in feeding hundreds of retainers and guests. Yet, whether rich or poor, all kitchens depended on the same principles: the manipulation of fire, the containment of heat, and the ability to cut, grind, stir, and serve. Tools were extensions of human effort, shaping the form and flavor of every meal. Medieval kitchens were not defined by walls or countertops, but by the tools people wielded over fire. Iron, clay, stone, and wood combined to create a toolkit that was both humble and ingenious. These implements demanded skill, patience, and experience. In return, they turned raw ingredients into nourishment. The very shape of meals, soupy pottages, roasted joints, spice sauces, hearty loaves, reflected the tools used to create them. Cooking without modern kitchens was not a limitation, but a different world of practice, where every ladle, pot, and knife played a crucial role in survival. If the hearth was the heart of medieval cooking, then fuel was its lifeblood. Fire did not spring effortlessly from a knob or switch. It was coaxed into life through tinder and steel, fed constantly and managed with care. The resources needed to maintain even the simplest flame were precious, often contested, and sometimes scarce. To understand medieval cooking, one must understand not just the pots and recipes, but the very fuel that made them possible. In a world before coal mines and gas pipelines, medieval people relied primarily on wood. Forests across Europe provided the essential logs and kindling, but wood was not always abundant or accessible. By the high Middle Ages, much of the European landscape had been cleared for farming, leaving some regions with dwindling supplies. Laws tightly regulated who could gather wood, and peasants often faced restrictions on cutting live trees, forcing them to rely on fallen branches, brushwood, or even the right to collect estover, limited amounts granted by lords. Fuel scarcity shaped diets. Boiling was favored over roasting, partly because it consumed less wood. The cauldron could simmer for hours on a small, steady fire, while roasting required large, blazing flames. Villages planned communal activities, such as firing bakehouses, specifically to conserve resources. Despite challenges, wood remained the cornerstone of cooking. Different woods had different properties. Oak and beech burned hot and long, while softer woods like pine or birch ignited quickly but produced more smoke. Cooks developed an intimate knowledge of these distinctions, choosing the right wood for each purpose. Hardwood coals were ideal for baking, their long-lasting heat absorbed by the oven's walls. Quick-burning kindling was best for lighting fires or maintaining a gentle simmer. For peasants, gathering wood could be labor-intensive. Children were often sent to collect sticks and brush. In winter, frozen ground made the task harder, and competition for fuel sharpened. Some households mixed wood with crop waste, burning straw, chaff, or even dried stalks of beans to eke out supplies. Where wood was scarce or smoke undesirable, charcoal offered an alternative. Produced by burning wood slowly in a low-oxygen environment, charcoal was lighter to transport and burned hotter and cleaner than raw logs. It was especially useful in towns, where dense smoke could create health and fire hazards. Archaeological remains show charcoal widely used in both urban cookshops and noble kitchens. Charcoal, however, was costly. The process of making it consumed large quantities of timber, and charcoal burners often lived on the edges of forests, tending smoking mounds for days. Still, for large kitchens, castles, monasteries, or city taverns, charcoal's reliability justified the expense. In areas with fewer forests, such as Ireland, Scotland, and parts of the Low Countries, people turned to peat or turf. Cut from bogs and dried, peat burned more slowly than wood and produced a distinct earthy smoke. Though it lacked the fierce heat of hardwood, it was abundant where boglands spread. Peat smoke flavored food as surely as it warmed homes, contributing to regional culinary traditions. Even today, echoes of this survive in the smoky character of certain whiskies distilled with peat fires. Peat cutting was communal labor, often tied to seasonal rhythms. Families would spend days slicing blocks from the bog, stacking and drying them in the sun, then carting them home for use throughout the year. In poorer regions or among the landless, fuel creativity became essential. Dried dung, whether from cattle, horses, or sheep, served as a substitute for wood. Though it burned with less heat, it was free and plentiful where animals were kept. Combined with straw or chaff, dung fires could maintain low heat for stewing or baking flatbreads. Archaeological evidence shows dung used widely in rural and pastoral communities. Other organic matter, nutshells, husks, or brush, might be added to fires. Nothing was wasted in a world where survival hinged on stretching resources. Even the ashes from fires were reused, mixed with water to make lye for cleaning or soap making. Fuel alone did not guarantee a good meal. Managing the fire was an art in itself. A skilled cook knew how to build a fire for different tasks. A roaring blaze was needed to heat an oven or roast meat, while a banked bed of embers provided steady heat for a cauldron. Wood was stacked carefully to ensure air could flow. Embers were raked, spread, or piled depending on the required temperature. Iron tools helped in this management. Andirons, metal supports, held logs off the ground for airflow. Fire dogs supported spits and kept wood aligned. Pokers and tongs allowed cooks to shift embers or lift hot pots without burning themselves. The constant attention required to maintain the right heat was as important as any recipe. It was said that good cooking was less about ingredients than about the cook's hand with the fire. Access to fuel was also a marker of social class. Nobles, with estates and rights to forests, could afford to consume massive amounts of wood for heating and cooking. Their kitchens might keep multiple fires blazing at once, one for roasting, another for boiling, a third for sauces. They could even afford charcoal, ensuring hotter, cleaner flames. For peasants, by contrast, fuel shortages meant careful rationing. Fires were banked low, cooking done sparingly, and ovens used communally. Urban environments sharpened these divides further. In cities, fuel cost money, and poor families sometimes rented space at public cookshops rather than burn their own scarce wood. The smell of roasting meat or frying fish spilling from these shops testified to the role of fuel as a commodity as much as a necessity. Fuel brought danger as well as sustenance. Thatched roofs, timber beams, and crowded towns made fire a constant threat. A spark from a cooking fire could consume an entire village. Chronicles record devastating blazes sweeping through medieval towns, often beginning in kitchens or bakehouses. As a result, regulations emerged. In London, for instance, certain industries involving fire were pushed outside city walls, and communal bakehouses were supervised for safety. Even in rural cottages, fire accidents were common. Children playing near the hearth could be burned, clothing might catch sparks, and smoke inhalation was a silent hazard. Yet despite the risks, there was no alternative. To cook meant to risk fire. Beyond practicality, fire carried deep cultural and symbolic weight. It represented warmth, survival, and even divine presence. In some traditions, the hearth fire was never allowed to go out, a symbol of household continuity. In monasteries, the kitchen fire became part of the sacred duty of feeding the brethren. In towns, the communal oven or bakehouse fire became a symbol of cooperation, a shared resource that bound neighbors together. Fuel, then, was not only physical material. It was the thread connecting forest, field, household, and community. It shaped what could be cooked, when meals were eaten, and how people thought about survival. Cooking in medieval times was inseparable from the struggle to secure and manage fuel. Wood, charcoal, peat, dung, each carried its own challenges and flavors. Each shaped the rhythm of meals. To cook was to negotiate constantly with scarcity, balancing heat against hunger, flame against safety. For peasants, a small bundle of sticks could mean the difference between warmth and cold. For nobles, roaring fires displayed wealth and power. Across all classes, fuel defined the possibilities of the kitchen. In the medieval world, every meal began not with a recipe, but with the question, do we have fire? If fuel and tools set the stage for cooking, the true drama of daily survival in medieval Europe was played out in the meals themselves. While noble feasts dazzled with spices and spectacle, the reality for the vast majority was far simpler. Daily eating revolved around repetitive, filling, and practical foods designed to make the most of scarce resources. Chief among these was the ubiquitous dish known as pottage. To understand pottage is to understand how most medieval people nourished themselves from cradle to grave. Pottage was not a single recipe, but a method of cooking. A thick stew made of grains, pulses, and vegetables, flavored when possible with meat, fish, or herbs. It was endlessly adaptable. A base of oats, barley, or rye might be combined with peas, beans, onions, leeks, carrots, or turnips. A bone from yesterday's slaughter or a strip of bacon might be thrown in to enrich the broth. Herbs like parsley, sage, or garlic added variety when available. The texture ranged from soup-like to porridge thick, depending on ingredients and cooking time. Most importantly, pottage was continuous. The cauldron rarely emptied. Instead, families added to it day by day. A visitor might taste the same pot simmering on Monday that had been started on Friday, now thickened with fresh cabbage and flavored with the remnants of Sunday's feast. This continuity made pottage not just a meal, but a living symbol of the household, always simmering, always sustaining, always changing. It also conserved fuel. Keeping one pot hot was far more efficient than starting anew for every meal. If pottage filled bellies, bread provided the backbone of sustenance. Across medieval Europe, bread was consumed at almost every meal, though its form and quality varied dramatically by class. Peasants often ate dark rye or barley bread, coarse and dense, sometimes mixed with ground peas or beans to stretch the flour. Wheat bread, lighter and whiter, was prized and often reserved for the wealthy or for feast days. In towns, regulations such as the assize of bread in England fixed prices and weights, ensuring bread was both affordable and consistent. Bakers faced heavy penalties for cheating customers. The process of baking tied communities together. In many villages, families prepared their dough at home but baked it in a communal oven, since fueling an oven privately was prohibitively expensive. Loaves were scored with identifying marks before baking, ensuring each household received its rightful share. Bread was not only eaten plain, but also used as tableware. Trenchers, thick slabs of stale bread, served as plates, absorbing juices and sauces before being eaten or fed to the poor. In many households, especially in rural areas, dairy products were critical. Milk from cows, goats or sheep was rarely drunk fresh by adults. It spoiled too quickly. Instead, it was transformed into butter, cheese or curds, all of which could be stored longer. Fresh cheese and curds provided protein in everyday diets, while harder cheeses lasted through winter or were traded in markets. Butter, though common in northern Europe, was less used in the Mediterranean, where olive oil dominated. Eggs were another staple, though their availability fluctuated with the seasons. Hens laid more in spring and summer, less in the dark of winter. Eggs could be boiled, fried or baked into pastries in wealthy households, but for peasants they were often eaten simply when available. Vegetables formed the bulk of the common diet. Onions, leeks, garlic, cabbage, turnips, carrots, often purple or white rather than orange, and beets were frequent inclusions in pottage. In fact, the medieval diet was more vegetable-heavy than many imagine, especially on days when the church forbade meat. Legumes, beans, peas, chickpeas, lentils were particularly important, providing necessary protein and calories. Dried legumes could be stored through winter, making them a lifeline during lean months. Gardens, tended by women and children, supplied these vegetables and herbs. Known as kitchen gardens or pottages, they grew close to the home for easy access. Herbs such as sage, parsley, dill and thyme flavored dishes, while medicinal plants like rue or comfrey were cultivated for health as much as for food. For the majority, meat was not daily fare. Livestock was too valuable to slaughter often. Animals provided milk, wool or labor, and were eaten mainly when they could no longer produce. Pork was the most common meat in Europe, as pigs were cheap to raise and could forage in woods. Beef was rarer, reserved for larger households. Poultry, chickens, ducks, geese provided both meat and eggs, but again they were often preserved for special occasions. Fish, however, held a unique place in the diet. The church imposed numerous fasting days, sometimes nearly half the calendar, when meat was forbidden. On such days, fish became the primary alternative. Fresh fish was available near rivers, coasts, or lakes, but inland communities relied on preserved fish, salted cod, herring in barrels, or dried stockfish. Monasteries and castles sometimes built fish ponds to ensure steady supplies. Wealthy households prized exotic imports like sturgeon or lampreys, while commoners made do with herring or eel. Meals were fewer and simpler than today. In many peasant households, there were typically 2 meals per day, one around mid-morning after the first labor, and another in the evening. Breakfast, as we know it, was rare except for children or laborers needing extra strength. Meals centered on bread and pottage, supplemented with ale, cheese, or seasonal produce. For wealthier families, meals were more elaborate, but still followed a similar rhythm: a late morning dinner and an evening supper. Even then, courses and variety depended on resources. Monastic communities regulated meal times with bells, while nobles turned dining into ritual with courses, servers, and carefully staged presentation. Water was not always trusted, especially in towns where contamination was common. Instead, most people drank ale, a weak, lightly fermented drink brewed from barley. This small ale contained little alcohol, but was safer than water and consumed even by children. Stronger ale or beer, the latter made with hops, increasingly popular in the later Middle Ages, was enjoyed on special occasions or by those with means. In wine-growing regions, particularly in France, Spain, and Italy, wine was the everyday drink for many. Quality varied, with peasants drinking thin, sour vintages, while nobles savoured imported varieties. Where vineyards were absent, ale remained dominant. For medieval people, daily meals were rarely about luxury. They were about staving off hunger. Chronic shortages, poor harvests, and famines haunted communities. In such times, people stretched their pottage with weeds, bark, or acorns. Accounts from the 14th century describe peasants surviving on bread, mixed with ground peas or beans when wheat failed. Yet even in hardship, food was central to community life. Meals were shared, bread was blessed, and feasts, however humble, marked the passage of time. Pottage and bread defined medieval survival. These simple foods, supplemented with dairy, vegetables, and occasional meat or fish, formed the steady rhythm of daily eating. While nobles dined on spiced banquets, the common cauldrons simmered with continuity and modesty, carrying the household from one day to the next. Cooking without modern kitchens did not mean chaos. It meant dependence on a handful of flexible, nourishing staples. In this repetition lay both hardship and stability, the quiet assurance that, however meagre, tomorrow's pottage would be waiting on the fire. If pottage was the steady hum of medieval life, bread was its firm backbone. Few foods held such symbolic and practical weight. To eat bread was to eat civilization itself, a sign of agriculture, community, and survival. Across medieval Europe, bread occupied not only the table but the imagination, bound to religion, law, and the rhythms of the village. To understand medieval cooking without modern kitchens, one must step into the bakehouse, where heat, flour, and fire turned grain into the staff of life. Bread was not merely food. It carried deep religious symbolism, from the biblical daily bread to the Eucharist at the center of Christian worship. To be denied bread was to be denied sustenance itself. Famines were often remembered as times without bread, even when other foods might still have been available. The word itself became synonymous with life. Its importance meant that bread carried social meaning. The type of bread one ate signaled status. Peasants ate coarse bread of rye, barley, or oats, often dark and heavy. These loaves sometimes contained pea or bean flour mixed with cereal grains, stretching supplies. Nobles, by contrast, consumed fine white wheat bread, sieved to remove bran and baked into loaves of lighter texture and color. Manchet bread in England, or pain blanc in France, was a delicacy of the elite. While noble estates and monasteries maintained their own ovens, most rural peasants did not bake at home. A bread oven required enormous amounts of fuel to heat, making it impractical for individual households. Instead, villages relied on communal bakehouses. On baking day, families carried their prepared dough to the oven. Each loaf was marked with an identifying score, a cross, a symbol, or initials, so the baker could return the right bread to its owner. The oven keeper, often appointed by the local lord or by custom, tended the fire until the stone walls glowed with stored heat. Ash and embers were swept out, and the loaves slid in on long-handled peels. The firing was an event. Neighbors gathered, exchanged news, and sometimes traded favors by baking extra loaves for those unable to attend. The bakehouse fire was more than an oven. It was a locus of community. In an age without refrigeration, fresh bread was precious, and baking days gave rhythm to the week. Heating an oven was costly. A large masonry oven required several hours of roaring fire to reach baking temperature. This expense explains why ovens were shared. Once hot, however, ovens were marvels of efficiency. The stored heat could bake multiple batches in succession, first bread, then pies or pastries, and finally slow-cooked dishes like beans or custards as the heat faded. In some places, villagers took advantage of the cooling oven to dry herbs, fruit, or even laundry. This cascading use of heat exemplifies medieval resourcefulness. In a world where wood or charcoal was never abundant, efficiency was survival. Because bread was so central, it was also regulated by law. In England, the assize of bread, first formalized in 1266, set strict rules for the price and weight of loaves, tied directly to the cost of grain. Bakers who cheated by underweight loaves or adulterated flour faced public humiliation. Some were placed in the pillory, their bad bread hung around their necks. In extreme cases, they could be fined or driven from the town. Similar regulations existed across Europe. Municipal councils inspected markets, ensuring loaves met standards. The aim was stability. When bread failed, riots followed. Indeed, some of the most explosive uprisings in medieval towns began with the cry that bakers had cheated the people. Bread was not just sustenance, it was a political matter. The type of bread consumed underscored class divisions. Black bread, made with rye or barley, was the everyday staple of peasants. It was filling but coarse, sometimes soured during fermentation. Maslin bread, a mix of wheat and rye, was common among middling folk. Nobles, as mentioned, ate fine white bread, sifted free of bran. This whiteness was not just about taste, but about status. To eat white bread was to display wealth. At feasts, white bread might even be carved into trenchers, thick slices serving as edible plates. After absorbing sauces and juices, these trenchers were sometimes eaten, but more often they were given to servants, beggars, or even dogs. Thus, bread reinforced hierarchy at the very table. For most people, bread was present at every meal. In peasant households, a hunk of coarse loaf accompanied pottage, dipped into ale, or eaten with cheese. In monasteries, bread was portioned carefully according to strict rules, often with allowances of so many ounces per monk per day. In noble households, bread formed the base of lavish courses, paired with spiced meats, wines, and sauces. Children gnawed crusts, travelers carried bread for journeys, and soldiers received bread rations as part of their pay. When crops failed, bread became the most visible absence, replaced by substitutes like acorn meal, chestnut flour, or even ground fern roots in times of famine. Chronicles lamented these desperate substitutions, noting their bitterness and the illness they caused. Over time, baking technology advanced. By the later Middle Ages, urban households sometimes had small ovens of their own, though these remained rare. Guilds of bakers emerged in towns, professionalizing the craft. These bakers not only served the community, but also supplied armies, monasteries, and noble courts with bread in massive quantities. The spread of more efficient milling also transformed bread. Windmills and watermills proliferating from the 12th century onward enabled greater flour production. This, in turn, expanded access to wheat bread in some regions, though disparities between classes remained stark. Bread bound people together, but it could also divide. Famines, often caused by crop failures or harsh winters, revealed how precarious dependence on bread could be. In the early 14th century, during the Great Famine, 1315 to 1317, chroniclers recorded people grinding bark, weeds, or bean husks into flour. Starvation haunted the poorest, while the wealthy hoarded grain. Bread riots erupted in towns across Europe, showing how central it was to both physical survival and social stability. Yet in ordinary times, bread was also an expression of generosity. Monasteries distributed loaves to the poor as alms. Lords gave bread at feast days, binding tenants to their service through shared food. The bakehouse fire, roaring with communal heat, stood as a symbol of solidarity, neighbors sharing both flame and sustenance. Bread was more than food. It was identity, class marker, political commodity, and spiritual symbol. Baked in communal ovens, eaten at every table, and regulated by law, bread sustained medieval Europe both physically and culturally. To break bread was to affirm membership in a community. To lack it was to face hunger and despair. Without modern kitchens, bread-making required effort, organization, and cooperation, but the results were life itself. In the medieval world, to ask, "Do you have bread?" was to ask whether one had the essentials to survive. And in the glow of the communal bakehouse, with loaves marked and slid into the oven's mouth, the medieval household found both nourishment and belonging. When we think of medieval meals, it is tempting to picture goblets of wine or mugs of frothing beer. The reality, however, was both simpler and more essential. For much of Europe, ale was life's daily drink. It was safer than water, nourishing in its own right, and consumed by all ages. Brewing was not a luxury but a household necessity, and in many communities the responsibility fell squarely on the shoulders of women. The story of ale and beer in medieval times is as much about survival as it is about taste. In medieval Europe, especially in towns and villages, clean drinking water was not guaranteed. Wells could be contaminated by waste, rivers by runoff, and cisterns by neglect. Boiling water could make it safer, but boiling alone consumed valuable fuel. Ale provided an elegant solution. The process of brewing required boiling the mash, effectively sterilizing the liquid, and the fermentation that followed inhibited many harmful microbes. The result was a drink that was far safer than untreated water. Children, laborers, peasants, and nobles alike consumed it daily. This small ale, weak in alcohol, often no more than 1 to 2%, refreshed and sustained without intoxication. Stronger versions were reserved for feasts, celebrations, or those who could afford them. For most households, brewing was as routine as baking bread. Ale was made in small batches, consumed quickly before it soured. Without hops, not widely adopted in England until the late Middle Ages, ale spoiled fast, often within a few days. This impermanence meant brewing was nearly constant. A family might brew once or twice a week, with women known as alewives overseeing the process. The basic recipe was straightforward. Grain, usually barley, though oats or wheat could be added, was malted, soaked, and dried. The malt was then mashed with hot water to extract sugars. The resulting liquid, the wort, was boiled and sometimes flavored with herbs, known as gruit, such as yarrow, rosemary, or bog myrtle. After cooling, yeast was added to ferment the wort into ale. Though simple in principle, brewing required skill. The alewife needed to judge temperatures without thermometers, rely on instinct for fermentation times, and balance flavors with available herbs. Too weak a brew, and the ale was watery. Too strong, and it risked being undrinkable for everyday consumption. The central role of women in brewing cannot be overstated. Brewing was considered an extension of domestic labor, like baking or dairying. Alewives brewed for their families, but many sold surplus to neighbors. In towns, some women turned brewing into a business, operating small-scale taverns or selling ale by the jug. Their image became so widespread that the word brewster came to mean a female brewer. This association with women persisted well into the medieval period, before men began to dominate the trade in larger commercial breweries. Some scholars argue that negative stereotypes of alewives, sometimes depicted as dishonest, greedy, or even associated with witch-like imagery, reflect anxieties over women's economic independence in brewing. Ale was more than hydration. It was liquid bread. The grains used for brewing provided calories, and even small ale offered a modest nutritional boost. Combined with bread, cheese, and pottage, ale formed part of a balanced survival diet. Laborers in fields relied on it to sustain their energy. In monasteries where water was distrusted, ale rations were standard. Records show monks receiving several pints per day, adjusted for strength and season. While ale dominated much of medieval Britain, Ireland, and Scandinavia, the story differed in continental Europe, particularly in the Low Countries and Germany. Here, brewers began experimenting with hops as early as the 9th century. Hops added not only bitterness, but crucially, preservative qualities. Hopped beer could last weeks or even months without souring, making it more suitable for storage and trade. By the 14th and 15th centuries, hopped beer had become a major export from the Low Countries, flowing into England and beyond. Initially, the English resisted. They found hopped beer bitter and unappealing compared to their sweeter ale. But the practicality of preservation eventually won out, and by the late medieval period, hopped beer began displacing traditional ale in many regions. Though household brewing was common, towns saw the rise of more organized brewing enterprises. Alehouses became central to urban life, offering not just drink, but social gathering spaces. In many towns, alewives or brewers displayed symbols outside their doors, branches, bushes, or a jug, to indicate fresh ale was available. Municipal authorities quickly realized the importance of regulating brewing. Just as bread was governed by the assize, ale was subject to laws on pricing, strength, and measures. Ale conners, officials appointed in towns, were tasked with inspecting and tasting ale to ensure quality and fairness. Punishments for cheating customers ranged from fines to humiliation, such as being forced to drink one's own bad brew in public. Beyond daily drinking, ale played a role in celebration. Weddings, harvest festivals, and saints' days demanded larger batches of stronger ale. Feasts in noble households featured multiple types, weaker ale for servants and retainers, stronger for the gentry. Ale also carried symbolic roles. Toasts and communal drinking bound people together, reaffirming community bonds. Even funerals incorporated ale. Records mention ale for the wake, where mourners gathered to drink, eat, and remember the dead. Brewing, then, was woven into the entire cycle of life events. Monasteries stood at the forefront of brewing innovation. With resources, labor, and knowledge, monks refined techniques, recorded processes, and brewed on a scale surpassing households. Monastic brewing provided sustenance for monks and hospitality for travelers. In some regions, abbey beers became renowned, laying foundations for traditions that continue today in Trappist breweries. Without thermometers, hydrometers, or refrigeration, medieval brewing was fragile. A batch could spoil if yeast failed or temperatures fluctuated. Contamination was common. This explains why brewing remained small-scale. Batches were consumed quickly, reducing risk. Successful alewives and brewers relied on experience, intuition, and oral tradition to maintain consistency. In the medieval world, ale was not an indulgence, but a necessity. It slaked thirst, provided calories, and brought neighbors together. Women, as household brewers and alewives, stood at the center of this practice, turning grain and water into sustenance through skill and labor. Over time, brewing grew into an industry, reshaping economies and even taste through the arrival of hops. But at its core, ale remained what it had always been, the everyday drink that made survival possible in a world without safe water. If fire made meals possible and bread filled daily stomachs, then preservation made survival itself feasible. In a world without refrigeration, fresh food spoiled quickly. Harvests came once a year, livestock could not be slaughtered daily, and long winters stretched hunger to the limit. To live through these cycles, medieval people turned to a repertoire of preservation methods, ingenious, labor-intensive, and essential. Scarcity was the constant spectre, and preservation was the shield. Meat began to rot within days in warm weather. Fish spoiled even faster. Milk soured within hours. Vegetables wilted, fruits rotted, and grain went moldy if damp. Against this constant decay, medieval cooks deployed strategies honed over centuries. Their goal was not to preserve freshness as we might today, but to extend usability, to prevent food from becoming dangerous and to stretch supplies into the hungry months of winter and early spring. Salt was the cornerstone of medieval preservation. Rubbed into meat, packed around fish, or dissolved into brines, it slowed microbial growth and drew out moisture. Salted pork, beef and fish were staples, sustaining households through winter and supplying armies on campaign. The importance of salt-shaped economies, coastal salt pans, where seawater evaporated in shallow beds, produced tons of salt for trade. Inland, salt mines such as those at Wieliczka in Poland or Salzburg in Austria made towns wealthy. Salt was expensive, often taxed, and sometimes controlled by kings or lords. To afford salt was to secure survival. In wealthy kitchens, salt was so prized it appeared on the dining table itself, with a master's seat marked by the placement of the salt cellar. To be seated above the salt was to enjoy honor and privilege. Yet for all classes, salt was less a luxury than a necessity, the difference between hunger and nourishment in February or March. Smoking was another key method, often used alongside salting. Meat or fish hung over a slow fire absorbed not only the drying heat, but also the antimicrobial compounds in smoke. Hams, sausages and eels gained distinctive flavors that became culinary traditions in their own right. Many cottages doubled as smokehouses, with rafters blackened by years of hanging cuts. The constant smoke from a central hearth lent itself naturally to curing. In towns, specialized smokehouses handled larger volumes, supplying markets with preserved fish or bacon. The smoky tang became the taste of preservation, a sensory reminder of survival strategies. Where salt and smoke were not available or affordable, pickling offered alternatives. Vegetables such as cabbages, onions, or cucumbers could be submerged in brines or vinegars, creating sour, tangy preserves that lasted through winter. In northern and eastern Europe, fermented cabbage, the ancestor of sauerkraut, became a staple. These foods not only kept, but also provided vital nutrients in times when fresh produce was absent. Fermentation extended beyond vegetables. Dairy was transformed into yogurts, kefirs or sour creams, grains into ales, fruits into ciders. Fermentation was, in many ways, medieval refrigeration, a controlled spoiling that made food safe, digestible and nourishing. Drying was perhaps the simplest method of all. Fruits such as apples, plums and pears could be sliced and left to dry in the sun or near the hearth. In warmer climates, figs, dates and raisins entered European diets through trade, prized both for sweetness and longevity. Dried beans and peas were staples of peasant fare, lasting months in sacks. Fish was dried on racks, particularly in northern Europe. Stockfish, dried cod from Norway and Iceland, became one of the most important trade goods of the Middle Ages, shipped across the continent. Lightweight, durable and protein-rich, it sustained armies, monasteries and towns alike. Milk was too perishable to store in liquid form, so medieval households transformed it. Cheese was the most durable, ranging from soft, fresh curds eaten within days to hard wheels aged for months. Butter, though shorter-lived, could be salted to last longer. These products were essential protein sources, especially during church-imposed fasting when meat was forbidden. Monastic communities often excelled at dairying, refining techniques that produced cheeses durable enough for trade. Some of these traditions survive today, with names like Parmesan or Roquefort tracing their roots to medieval monastic dairies. Cereal grains, wheat, rye, barley, oats were the backbone of medieval food. Preserving them meant preventing damp, mold, or vermin. Grain was stored in sacks, bins, or granaries, often elevated or ventilated to keep it dry. Lords required tithes of grain, and monasteries carefully recorded stocks, knowing that shortages could spark famine. In hard years, people stretched grain supplies by mixing flour with peas, beans, or chestnuts. In desperate times, chronicles describe bread made with ground acorns or fern roots, bitter and unhealthy, but keeping starvation at bay. Scarcity revealed just how fragile the grain supply could be. Even with preservation, medieval diets followed the seasons. Winter was lean, but the hardest time was the hungry gap of early spring, when old stocks ran low and new crops had not yet ripened. During these months, families survived on salted meats, dried beans, stored roots, and the remnants of grain. Malnutrition was common, and disease spread more easily among weakened populations. Famine loomed whenever harvests failed. The Great Famine of 1315–1317 demonstrated the fragility of food systems. Torrential rains ruined crops, grain prices soared, and millions starved. In such times, even preserved food could not save communities. People turned to bark, weeds, or whatever could be chewed. Chronicles speak of parents abandoning children, of theft and cannibalism, stark reminders of how close to the edge survival often stood. Preserving food was not only individual but communal. Villages organized shared salting of pigs in autumn when animals were slaughtered before winter. Families gathered at bakehouses not only for bread but sometimes to dry or roast other foods. Monasteries salted fish in bulk, distributing rations to lay workers and pilgrims. Preservation was labor-intensive, but shared effort spread both work and benefit. We should not imagine preserved foods as unpleasant necessities. Many became delicacies in their own right. Smoked hams, pickled vegetables, dried fruits, and aged cheeses developed flavors cherished at feasts. Spices from abroad often paired with preserved foods, masking saltiness or enhancing taste. Even in scarcity, medieval cooks found ways to transform preservation into cuisine. Without refrigeration, medieval people relied on ingenuity to bridge the gap between abundance and scarcity. Salt, smoke, pickles, drying racks, cheese presses, and granaries formed the arsenal of survival. Each method was not only practical but cultural, shaping taste, trade, and tradition. In the medieval world, cooking was never only about the present meal. It was about the future, the looming winter, the next famine, the hungry gap to come. Preservation was the art of anticipating scarcity. To cook without modern kitchens meant always planning ahead, always fearing hunger, and always seeking ways to stretch life a little further against the cold and the dark. If the peasant's hearth symbolized survival, the kitchens of the nobility embodied power and spectacle. Within the walls of castles, great halls, and manors, cooking expanded beyond necessity into a performance of wealth, hierarchy, and control. Here, meals were designed not only to feed hundreds, but also to impress, intimidate, and reinforce the social order. To step into a noble kitchen of the Middle Ages was to witness an operation as complex as any modern restaurant, except powered entirely by fire, manpower, and ingenuity. Unlike the single-room cottage with its central hearth, noble residences often separated their kitchens from the main hall. Fire was both essential and dangerous, and isolating the kitchen reduced the risk of flames consuming the residence. In castles, kitchens might be located in courtyards or separate wings, connected by passageways to the hall. These kitchens were enormous. Archaeological remains at sites like Hampton Court or Dover Castle reveal vast fireplaces large enough to roast entire oxen. Multiple hearths blazed at once, each serving different purposes, one for boiling, another for roasting, another for sauces. Chimneys and vents funneled smoke upward. Though the air was still hot, greasy, and pungent with cooking smells, the roar of flames, the clatter of pots, and the shouting of servants filled the space, creating a sensory storm. Feeding a noble household was the work of an army of servants. At the top stood the master cook, responsible for planning menus, ordering supplies, and overseeing preparation. Beneath him, and occasionally her, were specialized workers, spit boys, often children or young servants who turned roasting spits for hours, sauce makers, preparing complex condiments of herbs, spices and wine, pastry cooks who crafted pies and pastries for both savory and sweet dishes, scullions, the lowest rank, responsible for cleaning pots, scrubbing floors and hauling water. The kitchen hierarchy reflected the wider structure of feudal society. Everyone knew their role, from the steward who purchased food at market to the humblest potboy. Discipline was strict, and mistakes could carry harsh penalties, especially when meals for lords and honored guests were at stake. Noble kitchens were not confined to a single room. They were part of an interconnected system of storage and preparation spaces. The pantry handled bread, trenchers and dry goods. The buttery, from butts of wine, oversaw drinks from ale to imported wines. The larder managed meat and fish, often salted or stored in cool chambers. The spicery housed costly imports such as pepper, saffron, cinnamon and sugar. Each of these rooms had its own staff and responsibilities. The pantry boy, for instance, might guard loaves jealously, since bread was currency in its own right. The buttery was entrusted to trusted servants, since wine and ale were expensive and prone to theft. These spaces made the noble kitchen not just a workplace, but a miniature economy. The most dramatic form of noble cooking was roasting. To roast an animal whole, whether a deer, a pig, or even an ox, was to display wealth. Roasting consumed enormous amounts of fuel and meat, resources beyond the reach of peasants. In noble kitchens, lines of spits turned before massive fires, basted with herbs and wine. Servants used long skewers to pierce the meat, testing its doneness by eye and experience. The sight of roasted animals, often brought whole into the hall and carved in front of guests, was theatrical. It reminded everyone present of the Lord's ability to provide abundance. At feasts, roasted peacocks or swans might even be served with feathers reattached for display, a mixture of spectacle and excess. While roasting provided grandeur, sauces provided sophistication. Medieval noble kitchens delighted in elaborate sauces made with ground almonds, wine, vinegar, sugar, and exotic spices. These sauces balanced sweet, sour, and savory flavors in combinations unfamiliar to modern palates. Meat might be paired with fruit-based sauces, fish with almond cream, or game with peppery reductions. The heavy use of spices, cloves, cinnamon, ginger, saffron, was not to disguise spoiled meat, a common myth, but to display wealth. Spices were imported at enormous cost from Asia and the Middle East, passing through Venetian or Genoese merchants. To season generously was to demonstrate power in the most literal sense, the power to command trade routes and wealth. In noble kitchens, bread was not merely sustenance but artistry. Fine white manchet bread was baked daily for the table of the Lord, while coarser loaves fed servants. Pies, both savory and sweet, became canvases for culinary creativity. Pastry shells could act as cooking vessels, preserving meat inside crusts that were sometimes discarded after baking. Others, enriched with butter or sugar, were edible delights. Pies were also theatrical. Records describe pies from which live birds flew out when cut, or which contained elaborate sugar sculptures hidden inside. Such dishes delighted and astonished guests, reinforcing the host's magnificence. A noble household was not limited to family. Retainers, guards, clerks, visiting dignitaries and servants all needed feeding. A great hall feast might serve hundreds at once. Planning such meals was a logistical feat, requiring coordination of hunting, fishing, markets and preservation. Noble kitchens often maintained herds, fish ponds and game parks specifically to supply the table. Meals were served in courses, each presenting multiple dishes simultaneously. Guests might choose from roasted meats, spiced stews, fresh breads, pies, fish, cheeses and fruits, all accompanied by generous ale or wine. Even servants benefited from this abundance, though they ate lower quality food or leftovers. Despite grandeur, noble kitchens faced the same challenges as all medieval cooking: smoke, soot, and fire risk. Fires could spread quickly, and grease built up on walls and floors. Scullions labored endlessly to scrub pots, fetch water, and dispose of waste. Meat spoiled quickly in summer, even in cool larders, forcing constant vigilance. Monks and noble households alike employed salting and smoking, but wealthy kitchens still relied heavily on fresh supplies, delivered daily by huntsmen, fishmongers, and market vendors. The noble kitchen was also a political tool. To invite guests to a feast was to demonstrate generosity. To fail to provide was a mark of weakness. Chronicles often describe kings and lords bankrupting themselves on feasts, understanding that lavish dining projected strength. The kitchen, then, was an engine of diplomacy as much as gastronomy. Servants in kitchens also became power brokers. Trusted cooks or stewards might wield influence through their proximity to the Lord's table. Control of food meant control of loyalty, and loyalty was the currency of medieval politics. The noble kitchen was more than a place of cooking. It was a theatre of abundance, hierarchy, and spectacle. Fires roared, spits turned, sauces simmered, and pies astonished. Beneath the grandeur, however, lay the same realities faced by peasants: the need to manage fire, preserve food, and stretch resources. Yet where peasants coaxed nourishment from humble cauldrons, nobles turned kitchens into stages upon which wealth, power, and prestige were displayed for all to see. If noble kitchens were engines of abundance, then the feast was their grand performance. To dine in a medieval great hall was to witness more than a meal. It was a ritual of hierarchy, hospitality, and spectacle. Guests were not only fed but choreographed, immersed in a display of wealth and order that reinforced the very structure of medieval society. Food filled bellies, yes, but it also carried political weight, spiritual symbolism, and theatrical delight. The great hall of a castle or manor was both dining room and stage. Long trestle tables stretched the length of the chamber, while the high table at the far end elevated the lord, his family, and honored guests. Position at table mattered immensely. To sit above the salt near the lord was a mark of favor. To sit below was to occupy a lower rung in the social order. The hall itself conveyed grandeur. Tapestries softened stone walls and displayed wealth. Chandeliers of candles flickered overhead, their wax dripping onto rushes strewn across the floor. Musicians might play from a gallery, filling the air with lute or harp. At feast time, the hall glowed with warmth, light, and noise, a stark contrast to the quiet, smoky cottages of peasants. Medieval feasts unfolded in courses, each bringing a variety of dishes served simultaneously. A three-course feast might involve a dozen or more separate dishes per course, creating abundance through sheer variety. First course, roasted meats, boiled fowl, fish for fasting days, hearty pottages. Second course, spiced sauces, pastries, pies, stews, custards. Third course, fruits, nuts, cheeses, wafers, and spiced wine. Guests chose from what was offered, but their options reflected status. The lord and honored visitors received the choicest cuts and most elaborate dishes. Lesser guests received plainer fare. The entire structure of the meal reinforced hierarchy, reminding everyone of their place. Feasts were highly choreographed. Servants did not simply carry dishes, they performed rituals of service. Dishes were announced as they entered, sometimes with fanfare of trumpets. The carving of meat was itself a skilled art, with manuals written to instruct carvers in the elegant slicing of swan, goose, or venison. To carve at table was an honor, reserved for those of trust and skill. Hand-washing was another ritual. Before dining, guests were offered basins and towels by servants, underscoring the transition from ordinary life into the sanctity of the meal. Bread trenchers were placed before each guest, and wine or ale was poured by servers from the buttery. Nothing about a feast was casual. Every gesture reinforced order. Perhaps the most striking feature of medieval feasts were the subtleties. Elaborate edible, or sometimes inedible, creations designed to astonish. These could include sugar sculptures shaped like castles or saints, pies from which live birds flew when cut, or meat dishes presented in disguise, such as fish made to look like venison. These spectacles were not mere frivolity. They were symbols of power. To command rare spices, sugar, and skilled cooks was to display wealth. To amaze guests with artistry was to reinforce the host's cultural refinement. Chronicles describe feasts where whole animals were roasted and redressed in their feathers, or where fountains flowed with wine. Guests were meant to marvel, to leave convinced of their lord's magnificence. The feast was also a political tool. To host a feast was to display generosity, a core expectation of medieval lordship. Guests were fed not only to satisfy, but to bind them in loyalty. A stingy lord risked rebellion. A lavish one commanded admiration. Alliances were sealed over courses of meat and wine. Marriages were celebrated with days-long banquets, during which gifts and favors were exchanged. Royal feasts reached even greater heights. Coronations, for example, demanded spectacular dining displays. In England, the coronation feast of Henry IV in 1399 involved thousands of dishes and included the ceremonial role of the king's champion, who rode into the hall in full armor to challenge any who doubted the king's right to rule. Feasting was never just eating. It was statecraft by other means. Though lavish, feasting was not entirely free of restraint. The church's calendar shaped what could be eaten and when. On fasting days, meat was forbidden, so fish, eggs, and dairy took center stage. Yet even these restrictions became opportunities for creativity. Records tell of fish molded to resemble venison, or almond milk used to create dairy-like dishes during Lent. Feasts also often began with prayers and blessings, framing abundance within the context of divine providence. The act of breaking bread together echoed the sacred significance of the Eucharist. Even if the feast itself was more about politics than piety, dining was accompanied by a host of entertainments. Minstrels sang, jesters performed, and acrobats amazed. Storytellers recited romances of Arthur or Charlemagne. Sometimes mock battles or tournaments entertained guests between courses. The feast, then, was multi-sensory theatre, combining taste, sight, sound, and narrative. For nobles to eat without entertainment would have been unthinkable. The feast was not only nourishment but performance, one that reinforced cultural ideals of chivalry, magnificence, and hierarchy. It is easy to imagine only nobles enjoying these spectacles, but servants and lower-ranking attendees experienced them differently. While nobles dined at high tables, retainers and workers were fed plainer portions, often in adjoining rooms or in the same hall, but further down the table. Leftovers might be distributed to the poor at the gates, part of the lord's display of charity. For the commoner lucky enough to glimpse or taste a noble feast, the abundance was staggering. Spiced dishes, fresh fruits, white bread and sweet wines were luxuries unimaginable in daily life. The feast served to remind peasants of their lord's power and their dependence upon it. So important were feasts that they entered the historical record. Chroniclers described them in detail, not only for their abundance, but for their symbolism. A great feast might be remembered for decades, cementing a lord's reputation. Royal accounts meticulously listed the quantities of meat, fish, spices, and wine consumed, both as record-keeping and as propaganda. The message was clear. Here is a ruler who can provide. The medieval feast was more than sustenance. It was theatre, politics, piety, and entertainment combined. To eat at such a table was to participate in a ritual that reinforced social hierarchy and displayed wealth. Every course, every carving, every subtlety served a purpose beyond the plate. In a world without modern kitchens, the noble feast transformed cooking into performance art, where fire and flavor became tools of power. For peasants, survival depended on the steady simmer of pottage. For nobles, survival of reputation depended on the blazing spectacle of the feast. In this way, food became both the humblest necessity and the grandest display, two sides of the same medieval coin. If noble kitchens were theatres of power and peasant hearths the pulse of survival, monastic kitchens represented something else entirely, the marriage of food and faith. Monks and nuns across medieval Europe lived within tightly regulated communities where every meal carried spiritual weight. To cook in a monastery was not simply to prepare nourishment, it was to perform an act of discipline, humility, and service to God. Most medieval monasteries followed the rule of Saint Benedict, written in the 6th century, which laid down detailed instructions for daily life. Food was central to this rule. Monks were expected to eat simply, avoiding gluttony, and to treat meals as times of reflection rather than indulgence. The rule prescribed 2 cooked dishes at each meal, so that those who could not stomach one might eat the other. A pound of bread per day was allowed, along with fruit or vegetables when available. Meat from 4-footed animals was generally forbidden to monks except in illness, though fish and poultry were permitted in some communities. Wine was tolerated, but drunkenness was condemned. The emphasis was on moderation, enough to sustain work and prayer, never enough to encourage excess. Monastic kitchens were organized with military precision. Unlike peasant cottages or even noble halls, monasteries were self-contained worlds. They produced, processed, and consumed food largely within their own walls. The kitchen itself was often a large, separate building with spacious hearths and ovens. Fire hazards made separation practical. The refectory or dining hall was where monks ate together in silence. Long wooden tables faced each other, and the abbot's seat stood at the head. The cellarer was the monk responsible for supplies: grain, wine, oil, salt, and fish. His role was vital, ensuring discipline in storage and distribution. The cook was appointed for a term, not a lifetime. The rule of St. Benedict specifically stated that monks should share kitchen duties, so no one grew proud or resentful. This system ensured order. Every monk, from abbot to novice, shared in both consumption and service. The act of cooking and serving became a form of humility and discipline. Perhaps the most distinctive feature of monastic food culture was its strict adherence to the fasting calendar of the Church. On fasting days, which included Advent, Lent, and numerous saints' days, meat was forbidden. In practice, this meant nearly half the year excluded flesh from the diet. Fish became the main substitute. Monasteries often owned fish ponds, carefully maintained to supply carp, pike, or eel year-round. Salted herring, imported in barrels from the North Sea, became a staple in many inland communities. Fish was not merely sustenance, but a form of spiritual obedience, allowing monks to practice discipline without endangering their health. Monasteries also turned to legumes, beans, peas, and lentils for protein. Almond milk, surprisingly common in medieval Europe, became a favored substitute for dairy during fasting periods. Made by grinding almonds with water and straining the liquid, it was versatile, nutritious, and allowed in place of milk and butter when those were forbidden. Meals in monasteries were not noisy affairs like noble feasts. In the refectory, monks ate in near silence while one brother read aloud from scripture or the lives of the saints. This practice reinforced the idea that food was secondary to spiritual nourishment. The meal was less about pleasure than about sustenance, framed by reflection and discipline. To reduce temptation, monks ate facing each other across long tables, never in isolation. They were reminded constantly that their eating was a communal act, part of their shared devotion. To break silence without necessity was a fault to be confessed. Despite the rules, monastic meals could be abundant compared to the poorest peasants. Monasteries often controlled vast lands, which provided grain, vegetables, orchards, and herds. Bread was baked daily in monastic ovens. Vegetables from cloister gardens, leeks, onions, herbs, cabbage, featured prominently in stews and pottages. Fruits from orchards were eaten fresh or dried, and honey from monastery hives sweetened dishes when sugar was unavailable or too costly. Yet preparation remained simple. Food was boiled, stewed, or roasted, but rarely spiced as heavily as in noble kitchens. The aim was nourishment and balance, not luxury. To eat richly was to risk spiritual corruption. To eat humbly was to imitate Christ and the saints. Monasteries were not closed kitchens. They served as centers of hospitality, feeding travelers, pilgrims, and the poor. Benedict's rule commanded that all guests who present themselves are to be received as Christ. This extended to meals. Guests were given food in guest houses, often better than the monks' own portions. At the gates, bread and ale were distributed to beggars. Feeding outsiders reinforced the monastery's role as both spiritual and social institution. In times of famine, monastic stores could mean the difference between life and death for surrounding villages. Yet this generosity also affirmed power. To control food was to command gratitude and loyalty. Monasteries were also innovators in brewing. With abundant grain, clean water supplies, and disciplined labor, they produced ale and later hopped beer at high quality. Monastic brewing provided steady drink for monks and guests alike, free from the dangers of contaminated water. Over time, monasteries developed reputations for fine brews, some of which survive in traditions of Trappist and abbey beers today. Despite austerity, monasteries observed feast days with special meals. On major saints' days, additional dishes were prepared, sometimes including fish, poultry, or sweetened treats. Wine might be poured more generously, and portions increased. These moments punctuated the liturgical year, balancing fasting with celebration. Even within strict discipline, joy was permitted in measured doses. Monastic kitchens were not free from contradictions. Wealthy monasteries, especially by the 12th and 13th centuries, sometimes bent rules, indulging in more meat or wine than Benedict's rule envisioned. Critics accused monks of hypocrisy, living richly while preaching poverty. Satirical poems mocked gluttonous abbots and wine-loving friars. Reform movements within the church repeatedly tried to restore discipline to dining. Still, even in their lapses, monasteries embodied a unique relationship between food and faith. Every loaf of bread, every ladle of pottage, every portion of fish was framed by spiritual meaning. To eat was to live, but also to practice devotion. The monastic kitchen was unlike the peasant hearth or the noble hall. It was a place where cooking was not about display or mere survival, but about discipline, humility, and charity. Food was treated as a gift from God, to be shared in silence, rationed with care, and extended to the stranger at the gate. In the great rhythm of medieval life, monasteries provided a counterpoint, a vision of food as spiritual practice. Their kitchens remind us that in the Middle Ages, eating was never only biological. It was social, political, and, above all, sacred. While peasants simmered pottage on humble hearths and nobles staged spectacles in their halls, another vital world of cooking thrived in the streets, markets and cookshops. These spaces brought together farmers, merchants, travelers, laborers and townsfolk. They provided food for those who had no kitchens, no time, or no access to fuel. In an era when urban life was growing, cookshops became the medieval equivalent of fast food. Essential, lively, and sometimes controversial. Markets were the heartbeat of medieval towns. Chartered by kings or lords, they brought together producers and buyers on designated days. Market squares bustled with stalls piled high with bread, cheese, salted fish, sausages, and seasonal produce. Farmers' wives hawked eggs or butter. Butchers displayed carcasses or cuts of meat, while fishmongers rinsed their wares with buckets of water to keep them fresh. For townsfolk without land, markets were essential sources of food. Most people did not have space for gardens or livestock in cramped urban quarters. Markets linked city and countryside, drawing in goods from miles around. They also offered variety. Spices, dried fruits, and imported goods flowed through trade routes, making markets not just places of survival, but of opportunity for new flavors. Markets were tightly regulated. Officials inspected weights and measures to prevent cheating. Prices were sometimes capped to prevent exploitation. Sanitation, however, was less reliable. Blood from butchers mixed with mud, fishmongers dumped waste into streets, and meat spoiled quickly in summer. Yet despite these drawbacks, markets were lifelines, where choice and abundance, however modest, were visible to ordinary people. Beyond raw ingredients, markets gave rise to cookshops, small businesses where prepared food could be purchased ready to eat. For laborers, apprentices, or travelers without kitchens, these shops were indispensable. They offered hot meals at affordable prices, catering to those who could not afford fuel or time to cook for themselves. Cookshops often specialized. Some roasted meat, selling portions by weight. Others fried fish or prepared pies filled with meat, eggs, or vegetables. Stews and pottages were common, ladled into bowls for hungry customers. Bread and ale were nearly always on offer, ensuring a complete if simple meal. Descriptions of medieval cookshops paint them as bustling, smoky places. Fires burned constantly, and the scent of roasting meat or frying fish drifted into the streets. Patrons crowded in, eating quickly before returning to work. In many ways, they were the medieval world's equivalent of taverns, diners, or takeout counters. Not all public eating happened in cookshops. Taverns and alehouses offered drink as their main commodity, but food often accompanied it. Patrons could bring their own bread or purchase simple fare like cheese, cold cuts, or pies. Inns catering to travelers offered more substantial meals, including hot stews or roasted meats. These establishments were important social spaces. Deals were struck, gossip exchanged, and communities bound together over shared food and drink. Taverns and alehouses sometimes blurred with cookshops, their fires and pots serving locals as much as visitors. Regulations distinguished them. Taverns were licensed for wine, alehouses for ale, and inns for lodging. But in practice, all provided nourishment for those who needed it. Cooking was not confined indoors. Street vendors sold ready-to-eat items to passers-by: pies, pancakes, hot chestnuts, or fried fish. In London, vendors sold oysters by the handful. In Paris, one could buy hot waffles from portable irons. These foods catered to the poor and the mobile, filling gaps between meals. Street food was cheap but risky. Authorities worried about hygiene, fearing spoiled fish or adulterated pies. Ordinances sometimes banned vendors from certain areas or required inspections, yet their popularity persisted. Just as today, convenience outweighed concerns, and the sight of a vendor's steaming tray was part of urban life. Public cooking inevitably drew regulation. Town officials worried about fires, waste, and public order. Cookshops were inspected for cleanliness and fairness, much like bakeries or breweries. But they were also sometimes viewed with suspicion. Chroniclers and moralists complained that cookshops encouraged gluttony, idleness, or immorality. Some associated them with gambling, prostitution, or crime. Despite these criticisms, cookshops thrived. They filled a necessary niche. In towns where many lived in cramped rooms without hearths, and where apprentices or laborers could not cook for themselves, cookshops provided survival. To deny them was to risk hunger in the city. Cookshops also introduced urban dwellers to foods they might never taste at home. Roasted meats were costly for peasants in villages, but in towns, even a small cut could be purchased. Fish, fried or stewed, became available inland, thanks to trade. Imported items, figs, raisins, almonds, might appear in pastries sold at market stalls. Urban cooking thus expanded culinary horizons, exposing ordinary people to greater variety. For the wealthy, markets and cookshops were less about necessity and more about convenience. Chronicles note nobles sending servants to buy roasted meats or pies when kitchens were overwhelmed. Even kings occasionally sampled street food incognito, mingling with subjects over simple fare. Though humble compared to the Great Hall, the cookshop was still a social hub. Workers gathered to eat together, apprentices pooled coins for shared meals, and travelers exchanged stories. Food brought people into contact across trades and neighborhoods. In some cases, guilds or fraternities organized communal meals at local cookshops, strengthening bonds. For women too, cookshops could provide both employment and independence. Many were run by widows or single women, echoing the tradition of alewives. Their presence in the public food economy blurred the line between domestic and commercial cooking, challenging assumptions that food preparation belonged only in private homes. The medieval town depended on markets and cookshops not only for variety but for survival. Urban populations could not feed themselves from within city walls. Grain, meat, fish and vegetables flowed in daily from surrounding countryside. When supplies faltered, due to war, poor harvest or disease, towns faced shortages quickly. Cookshops, reliant on fresh supplies, became the first barometers of crisis. Bread riots often began in markets where prices soared and supplies dwindled. Cookshops, unable to serve their customers, closed their shutters. In this way, the fragile balance of medieval urban food security was revealed. Without constant inflow, the market square fell silent. Markets and cookshops were the public hearths of medieval towns. They provided nourishment for the landless, convenience for the busy, and variety for the curious. They were noisy, smoky, and sometimes unsanitary, but they were also vital to the growth of urban life. If the peasant's hearth embodied survival and the noble feast embodied power, the market and cookshop embodied community. They were spaces where strangers shared benches, where coins brought warmth and sustenance, and where the medieval city itself found its rhythm. Cooking without modern kitchens, in this context, meant relying on others' fires, on the skill of the cookshop keeper, the honesty of the market baker, and the delicate supply lines that kept towns alive. Cooking in medieval Europe was never a purely private matter. What people ate, when they ate it, and even how it was prepared were deeply influenced by two powerful forces, the church and civic regulation. Faith imposed fasting, feasting, and dietary restrictions, while towns enforced laws to maintain fair trade and public order. To cook without modern kitchens was not simply to wrestle with fuel and fire, but to navigate a world where food was as much about obedience and justice as it was about sustenance. The medieval diet was inseparable from the liturgical year. The Church prescribed days of fasting and abstinence that structured eating habits across Christendom. Lent, the 40-day season before Easter, required abstention from meat, dairy, and eggs. Fish, vegetables, bread, and pulses filled the gap. Almond milk replaced dairy in sauces and porridges. Advent, leading up to Christmas, carried similar restrictions in many regions. Ember days, vigils, and numerous saints' days further multiplied fasting obligations. In some places, nearly half the year was spent under some form of dietary restriction. These fasts were not meant to starve, but to discipline. By restraining the body, believers demonstrated humility and devotion. Food thus became a tool of spiritual practice. Because meat from four-footed animals was banned on fasting days, fish rose to prominence. Salted herring became one of the most traded commodities in Europe. Inland monasteries dug fish ponds to ensure steady supply, and rivers were carefully managed for eels and carp. Coastal communities thrived by exporting fish inland, and towns established fish markets specifically to serve fasting needs. Fish dishes were often creative. Recipes survived for pike in almond sauce, eels roasted on spits, or even fish molded and spiced to resemble venison. The ingenuity shows how cooks sought both to obey rules and to maintain variety. If fasting represented restraint, feasting balanced the scale. Holy days, weddings, and coronations demanded abundance. The church calendar thus swung between scarcity and plenty, training medieval Christians to see food not only as sustenance but as spiritual rhythm. Feasts were also acts of charity. Lords and monasteries distributed alms of bread, ale, or meat on feast days, reinforcing both religious obligation and social hierarchy. To deny food on such occasions was to fail in duty. While the church shaped when and what people ate, municipal authorities regulated quality and price. Food was too important to leave unchecked. In England, the Assize of Bread and Ale, 1266, established fixed weights and prices for loaves and measures of drink. Bakers were required to adjust the size of loaves according to the cost of grain, ensuring fairness for consumers. Ale, too, was inspected. Ale conners, in towns like London or Chester, literally tasted brews to judge their quality. Punishments for cheating were public and humiliating. Bakers who sold underweight bread might be paraded with their loaves around their necks or placed in the pillory. Brewers who watered down ale faced fines or worse. Such punishments reminded all that food was communal, not private. Cheating customers was an assault on the whole community. Meat, too, was tightly controlled. Butchers were expected to slaughter animals in designated areas to reduce waste and disease. In some towns, regulations forbade selling meat more than a day old. Inspectors checked that carcasses were wholesome and prices fair. Guilds enforced these rules. Bakers, brewers, butchers, and fishmongers organized into corporations that controlled training, quality, and pricing. Membership was both a privilege and a responsibility. To join, apprentices trained for years, learning both craft and moral obligations. Guilds provided not just regulation, but community identity, charity, and even funeral funds for members. For urban dwellers, guild control meant consistency. To buy bread or ale was to trust the guild's oversight. Yet guilds could also become monopolies, squeezing out independent traders and fixing prices to their advantage. Tension between guild authority and popular demand occasionally erupted into conflict. Moralists and preachers added another layer, the sin of gluttony. One of the 7 deadly sins, gluttony was often portrayed in sermons and artwork as overindulgence in food and drink. Excessive feasting was condemned not only for waste but for encouraging lust or sloth. Ironically, nobles and clergy themselves often indulged in rich feasts, drawing criticism from reformers. Satirical poems mocked gluttonous monks or wine-soaked abbots. Yet the ideal remained. Food was to be consumed with moderation, gratitude, and awareness of spiritual meaning. Regulation also marked cultural and religious boundaries. Jews in medieval Europe, for example, followed kosher laws, distinguishing their diet from Christian neighbors. This sometimes became a point of tension, as outsiders saw dietary difference as a marker of religious separation. Similarly, Christians defined themselves in part through fasting practices that distinguished them from pagan or Muslim communities. Food, therefore, was not only about survival, but about identity. To eat according to the rules was to belong. To transgress was to risk exclusion. In times of famine or war, regulation became urgent. Grain hoarding was punished harshly, as authorities sought to prevent starvation. During the Great Famine of 1315-1317, towns attempted to control prices, though shortages often rendered laws ineffective. Chroniclers describe riots at markets where desperate townsfolk demanded fair bread. Even in less dire times, regulation was constant. Inspectors checked weights, tasted ale, examined fish, and fined offenders. Cooking and eating were never purely private acts. They were public concerns monitored for the health of all. The intersection of faith and civic law was striking. For example, during Lent, not only did the church forbid meat, but town officials checked markets to ensure compliance. Selling meat in fasting times could incur both spiritual penalties and civic fines. The sacred and the secular overlapped, reinforcing each other. In this way, medieval people experienced food as deeply embedded in systems of power. Every loaf, every mug, every joint of meat was touched by both God and law. Cooking without modern kitchens was already a labor of fire, tools, and scarcity, but medieval cooks also labored under watchful eyes of priests, of guild officials, of town inspectors. What might seem private to us was in fact communal, regulated, and infused with meaning. Religion taught that food shaped the soul. Regulation taught that food shaped society. To eat was never neutral. It was obedience, justice, and identity served on a plate. For medieval people, the table was both altar and marketplace, bound by rules that ensured not only survival, but order itself. To speak of medieval cooking as a single tradition risks oversimplification. Europe in the Middle Ages was not uniform, but a mosaic of climates, resources, and customs. What peasants simmered in English villages differed from what merchants ate in Florence, or what farmers cooked in Scandinavia. Though united by Christianity, shared trade routes, and similar struggles against scarcity, regions developed distinctive culinary identities shaped by their landscapes. In medieval England, bread and ale were the cornerstones of the diet. Wheat was grown in the fertile south, but in much of the country, rye and barley dominated, producing darker, denser loaves. The communal bakehouse was central to village life, and regulations like the assize of bread and ale ensured consistency in markets. Ale, unhopped until late in the period, was brewed constantly in households, with women, alewives, leading production. Ale was drunk by all ages and classes, forming part of wages for labourers and soldiers. Roasting meat, particularly pork, was a popular method among those who could afford it. Hunting also shaped aristocratic food culture. Deer, boar, and game birds appeared on noble tables, their preparation reflecting wealth and privilege. Fish, especially herring, was vital on fasting days. England's coastal and river systems ensured plentiful supplies, and salted fish entered inland trade. France, with its fertile lands, vineyards, and political centrality, developed one of the most sophisticated medieval food cultures. Wheat bread was more common here than in much of northern Europe, though coarser breads were eaten by peasants. Nobles prized white loaves, while maslin, a mixture of wheat and rye, fed the majority. Wine, rather than ale, was the everyday drink in much of France. Vineyards in Burgundy, Bordeaux, and the Loire Valley supplied both domestic consumption and export. Even monasteries cultivated grapes, linking wine with both daily sustenance and sacrament. French aristocratic kitchens became known for their refinement. Sauces, often combining sweet and sour flavors, accompanied meats and fish. Recipes preserved in texts like Le Viandier, attributed to Taillevent, a 14th-century cook, show a love for spices, almond milk, and carefully balanced flavors. This tradition laid the foundation for what later became French haute cuisine. Medieval Italy, positioned between Europe and the Mediterranean world, developed a distinctive culinary identity. In the south, olive oil replaced butter as the primary fat, vineyards flourished, and wine was a daily drink. The fertile plains of the north supported wheat cultivation, leading to bread and porridge as staples. Italy's position in Mediterranean trade routes gave it access to spices, sugar, and citrus fruits earlier and in greater abundance than much of northern Europe. This created elite cuisines rich in imported flavors. Almonds, rice, and even early forms of pasta appeared in Italian records. By the 13th century, pasta, durable, storable, and adaptable, had begun to take root, particularly in southern Italy. Urban Italy also led the way in professional cookery. Cities like Florence, Venice, and Naples supported taverns, inns, and cookshops, catering to merchants and travelers. Recipes from Italian sources reveal experimentation with combinations of herbs, cheeses, and fish that reflect both local abundance and cosmopolitan influence. In the German-speaking lands and Central Europe, the medieval table leaned toward hearty fare. Bread was often made from rye, barley, or mixtures of grains, reflecting harsher climates less suited to wheat. Beer, brewed with hops from an earlier date than in England, became the dominant drink. By the 14th century, hopped beer was not only a staple, but a major trade product, exported from towns like Hamburg and Bremen. Meat played a prominent role, particularly pork and sausages. Preservation by smoking and salting was common, and sausages allowed meat to be stretched and stored efficiently. Cabbage, turnips, and legumes accompanied these dishes, forming robust meals designed for cold winters. Guilds strongly influenced urban food culture. Butchers, bakers, and brewers organized markets, ensuring that townspeople had reliable access to staple foods. In wealthier towns, elaborate feasts mirrored those of France, but with regional twists: roasted game, spiced wines, and pastries filled with dried fruits from southern trade. The Low Countries, modern Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg, occupied a strategic position between northern seas and continental trade routes. Their food culture was shaped by both land and water. Grain farming supported bread as the staple, while rivers and coasts made fish abundant. Herring was especially important. By the 14th century, innovations in curing and barrel storage allowed herring to be exported widely. This industry transformed diets not only locally but across Europe, feeding inland populations during fasting seasons. Beer culture flourished here too. Towns like Bruges and Ghent became centers of brewing innovation, adopting hops earlier than many regions and refining commercial techniques. This made the Low Countries a hub of medieval food trade, their cookshops and taverns buzzing with diversity. The Iberian Peninsula was a cultural crossroads. Christian, Muslim, and Jewish communities lived side by side, though not always peacefully, and their cuisines influenced one another. Moorish presence in southern Spain introduced rice, citrus fruits, almonds, and sugarcane, reshaping the food culture of the region. Bread remained central, but rice dishes, including early forms of paella, began to appear. Lamb and goat were common meats, while preserved fish, especially salted cod, spread across Iberia. Olive oil dominated cooking, alongside garlic and onions. Wine was widespread, but so too were sweet drinks flavored with honey or sugar. Pastries filled with nuts and honey echoed Moorish traditions, leaving a lasting imprint on Spanish and Portuguese cuisine. In Scandinavia, harsher climates meant fewer grains and shorter growing seasons. Rye bread was common, dense and dark. Oats and barley provided porridge and ale. Wheat was rare, reserved for the elite. Fish dominated the diet, both fresh and preserved. Stockfish, air-dried cod, became a major export, sustaining much of northern Europe. Herring fisheries were critical, particularly for fasting supplies. Meat was eaten, but less frequently, and preservation by smoking or drying was essential. Dairy products, milk, butter, cheese, were central to rural households. Cabbage, root vegetables, and wild berries supplemented the diet. Survival foods, such as bark bread, made by mixing ground tree bark with flour during famine, highlight the precariousness of life in this region. In Poland, Hungary, and other parts of Eastern Europe, food traditions reflected both local resources and influences from East and West. Rye and millet provided staple breads and porridges. Fermentation played a major role, with sauerkraut, sour rye soups, and fermented dairy common. Meat, particularly pork, was preserved through smoking and salting. Honey was a key sweetener, used in drinks like mead and in baked goods. The steppe traditions of nomadic peoples introduced elements like dumplings or filled pastries, blending with European bread-based diets. Across Europe, bread remained the anchor, whether wheat in France and Italy, rye in Germany and Scandinavia, or maslin in England. Preservation, salting, smoking, drying was universal. Yet each region's climate, trade and culture left its mark. Olive oil in Italy, beer in Germany, fish in Scandinavia, spices in France, and rice in Spain. Cooking without modern kitchens, then, was never a single story. It was a patchwork quilt, stitched together by geography and tradition. The common thread was survival, but the pattern was distinct from region to region. Medieval Europe was united by hunger, faith, and dependence on fire, yet divided by taste and tradition. A peasant in England, sipping ale and eating rye bread, lived a culinary life, worlds apart from a Florentine merchant savouring olive oil and pasta. A Scandinavian fisherman, drying stockfish for trade, shared little with a Spanish farmer tending olive groves. Yet all were connected in a shared network of trade, faith, and necessity. Regional variation reminds us that medieval food was never monolithic. It was as diverse as the landscapes and peoples of Europe, reflecting a continent bound together by bread, yet flavored by countless local traditions. By the late Middle Ages, European kitchens were not static relics, but evolving spaces. Between the 13th and 15th centuries, innovations in architecture, tools, and tastes transformed how people cooked and ate. These changes were not universal or immediate. Peasants still simmered pottage over open hearths, but across towns, monasteries, and noble estates, cooking entered a period of transition. The seeds of Renaissance cuisine were being sown long before the Renaissance itself. One of the most significant developments was the spread of the chimney. Early medieval houses and halls vented smoke through holes in the roof or open louvres. Fires burned in the middle of the room, filling interiors with soot and haze. But by the 12th and 13th centuries, wealthier households began installing chimneys that funneled smoke upward through brick or stone flues. The chimney had profound consequences. Fires could now be placed against walls, freeing central floor space. Kitchens became more specialized rooms, no longer indistinguishable from living quarters. More importantly, better control of smoke and airflow allowed for more efficient fires. Chimneys made it possible to add multiple fireplaces within a single kitchen, each with different functions: boiling, roasting, baking, or simmering. By the late Middle Ages, chimneys spread from castles and monasteries to more prosperous urban homes. Though peasants continued with smoky hearths for centuries, the chimney symbolized progress, a marker of technological refinement in cooking. Cookware also evolved. Ironworking improved, making pots and pans sturdier and more affordable. Cauldrons remained central, but new forms appeared: skillets and frying pans, allowing food to be seared or shallow fried, griddles for flatbreads, pancakes, or wafers. Copper vessels, prized for conducting heat, appeared in noble kitchens. Earthenware grew more varied, with glazed surfaces that resisted staining and absorbed fewer odors. The variety of pots meant greater flexibility in cooking. Foods could now be boiled, fried, grilled, or baked with increasing precision. For the wealthy, the kitchen became a workshop of experimentation, where cooks displayed artistry as well as practicality. Perhaps the most striking culinary shift of the late Middle Ages was the increasing use of spices and sugar. Global trade routes, channeled through Venice, Genoa, and the Levant, funneled cinnamon, ginger, saffron, nutmeg, and pepper into Europe. These ingredients were extraordinarily expensive, worth their weight in silver or gold, yet nobles demanded them in abundance. Sugar, too, became more prominent. Initially a luxury medicine from the Islamic world, by the 14th century it was appearing in noble kitchens as a sweetener for sauces, pastries, and conserves. This marked a departure from the honey-sweetened traditions of earlier centuries. Spices and sugar not only changed flavors, but also redefined social identity. To serve heavily spiced dishes was to signal wealth and cosmopolitan connections. Recipes from French and English cookbooks, such as Le Ménagier de Paris or The Forme of Curie, reveal complex preparations balancing sweet, sour, and savory in ways that dazzled medieval palates. Another late medieval trend was the professionalization of cooks. While household cooking remained the domain of women in peasant cottages, noble and urban kitchens increasingly relied on trained men who considered cooking a skilled craft. Some were literate, leaving behind recipe collections that revealed both technical expertise and artistic ambition. Cookbooks from this period are not instructions in the modern sense, but lists of ingredients and proportions, assuming knowledge of technique. Their existence, however, demonstrates how cooking was becoming more formalized, with shared standards and aspirations. Chefs in noble courts competed in sophistication, producing subtleties and banquets designed as much for spectacle as sustenance. Towns also saw innovation. Cookshops expanded, offering wider varieties of food to urban populations. Regulation grew more sophisticated. Guilds of bakers, brewers, and butchers enforced standards, but new guilds of cooks and pie makers emerged, formalizing what had once been informal trades. Cookshops increasingly catered to specific tastes. Some specialized in pastries, others in roasted meats or fried fish. Urban cooking thus reflected growing diversity of demand, as merchants, craftsmen, and travelers sought more than mere survival food. Though still rare, manuscripts of recipes circulated more widely by the 14th and 15th centuries. These texts preserved courtly cuisine, spreading influence across regions. For example, French culinary ideas found their way into English cookbooks, while Italian texts influenced both Spain and France. Cooking was no longer purely oral tradition. It was entering the realm of recorded knowledge, accessible to those with wealth and literacy. This exchange of culinary ideas foreshadowed the global cuisine of later centuries. By the late Middle Ages, European palates were changing. Pottage and bread remained staples, but nobles increasingly sought variety and novelty. Sweet and sour flavor profiles, combining sugar with vinegar or fruit, became fashionable. Pastries and pies gained prominence, both as practical containers and as canvases for artistry. New foods entered diets as trade expanded. Rice, imported through the Mediterranean, appeared in recipes for puddings and porridges. Citrus fruits, lemons, oranges, added brightness to sauces. Even pasta, particularly in Italy, was becoming more common. These were still luxuries, but their presence hinted at broader culinary revolutions to come. Archaeological remains show that by the 15th century, some noble and monastic kitchens were sprawling complexes with multiple rooms. Roasting houses, pastry rooms, breweries, dairies, and larders. Specialized spaces reflected increasing division of labor. At Hampton Court, built in the early 16th century but rooted in late medieval tradition, kitchens included massive roasting fires, boiling houses, and pastry chambers. Such structures reveal the transition from simple hearths to organized quasi-industrial spaces capable of feeding hundreds daily. Despite these innovations, continuity endured. Peasants in villages still cooked over open hearths with few tools. Pottage and rye bread still dominated their diets. Preservation by salting, smoking, and drying remained essential. Innovation was not evenly spread, but concentrated in urban centers, monasteries, and noble estates. The medieval kitchen was thus a world of contrast. On one side, smoky cottages where children stirred cauldrons of beans and cabbage. On the other, sophisticated court kitchens where cooks experimented with sugar sculptures and almond milk custards. Yet both were part of the same evolving landscape, slowly moving toward new possibilities. By the eve of the Renaissance, medieval cooking had transformed. Chimneys redefined hearths, new cookware expanded techniques, spices and sugar reshaped tastes, and professional cooks elevated cuisine into art. The foundation of survival, bread, pottage, ale remained, but layers of innovation had begun to accumulate. Cooking without modern kitchens was still arduous, smoky, and labor-intensive. Yet by the 15th century, it was also increasingly experimental, global, and ambitious. The medieval table was preparing to give way to the Renaissance banquet, where food would become not just sustenance or spectacle, but a reflection of science, exploration, and humanist curiosity. We have traced the world of medieval cooking, from peasant hearths and noble kitchens to monasteries, markets, and the bustling streets of towns. We have seen the technologies of cauldrons and bakehouses, the ingenuity of preservation, the spectacle of feasts, the discipline of fasting, and the gradual innovations that transformed cuisine by the late Middle Ages. Yet one question remains. What did all of this mean? Beyond sustenance, what role did cooking play in the fabric of medieval life? To answer, we must return to the hearth, not merely as a place of fire, but as the heart of culture, memory, and meaning. At its most basic, the hearth was survival. In peasant cottages, the fire represented warmth against bitter winters and nourishment from pottage, simmering day after day. Its constant glow was the thin line between hunger and health. To let the fire die was to risk calamity. Mothers passed embers from house to house, and children learned from infancy to respect flame. In this sense, the medieval hearth embodied continuity. It linked generations, binding the rhythm of life to the rhythm of the fire. For the poor, the hearth was humble, smoky, and often hazardous, but it was indispensable. Every pot of beans, every loaf baked in the communal oven was another day secured. For the nobility, fire signified not only survival, but dominion. Roaring castle kitchens, with spits turning whole oxen and sauces simmering in copper pans, transformed food into theatre. To host a feast was to proclaim wealth, command, and generosity. Guests marveled at subtleties in banquets, not only because of their flavor, but because they represented the reach of trade, the abundance of estates, and the sophistication of courtly culture. The hearth here was magnified into spectacle. Where the peasant's hearth whispered of survival, the noble kitchen thundered with power. Fires in multiple chimneys, tended by armies of servants, became symbols of authority itself. In monasteries, the hearth was an instrument of discipline and devotion. Meals eaten in silence, fish ponds tended with care, and kitchens staffed by rotating brothers all emphasized humility. The monastic kitchen fed not only the body, but also the soul, reminding monks daily of their dependence on God's gifts. Here, fire was not for display or indulgence, but for order and reflection. Even hospitality, bread for pilgrims, alms for the poor, framed the hearth as a place of service. Monastic cooking exemplified the balance of scarcity and generosity, fasting and feasting, always under the rule of faith. Markets and cookshops reveal another role, the hearth as public space. Fires in taverns, cookshops, and street vendors' stalls nourished those who had no kitchen of their own. Apprentices, laborers, and travelers gathered around shared bowls, creating bonds of community. Urban cookshops became the public hearths of towns, sustaining the working population and linking countryside produce to city demand. At communal bakehouses, too, the hearth symbolized interdependence. Families marked their loaves and placed them in ovens fueled by shared firewood. The act of baking was not solitary but collective, a reminder that survival was a shared endeavor. Cooking was also subject to regulation and faith. Bread and ale were weighed, tasted, and priced under civic law. Meat was restricted on fasting days, and fishmongers thrived under ecclesiastical demand. The hearth was never entirely private. It operated under the watchful eyes of inspectors, priests, and guilds. This dual oversight reflected deeper truths, that food was both sacred and social. To eat was to honor God, obey authority, and participate in community. To transgress by gluttony, fraud, or violation of fasting was not only a personal failing, but a communal threat. Even as tradition endured, the medieval hearth was also a site of innovation. The chimney, new cookware, spices and sugar transformed kitchens into more efficient, experimental spaces. Late medieval cookbooks reveal ambitions far beyond mere survival. Artistry, variety and refinement entered the picture. Yet innovation did not erase continuity. The peasant still stirred pottage, the monk still ate bread in silence, the fishmonger still salted herring. The medieval hearth was a paradox, both conservative and inventive, holding fast to old ways while absorbing new influences from trade and technology. Perhaps above all, the hearth symbolized life itself. Across Europe, fire was sacred, echoing ancient traditions that linked flame with divine presence. To gather at the hearth was to gather in safety, warmth, and belonging. In myths, legal customs, and daily practice, the hearth carried meaning beyond its material function. In many villages, the hearth marked property and inheritance. In courts, the phrase bread and salt symbolized loyalty and hospitality. To share food was to create bonds. The hearth was not only a physical fire, but also a metaphor for kinship, memory, and continuity. By the close of the Middle Ages, the hearth was beginning to change. Chimneys redefined domestic architecture, cookshops expanded urban diets, and spices broadened palates. Yet the essential role of fire in food persisted well into the modern era. Even as ovens, stoves, and later technologies emerged, the cultural memory of the hearth endured. Today, when we speak of hearth and home, we echo medieval realities. The hearth was the axis around which life turned, whether humble or grand. To understand medieval cooking without modern kitchens is to understand a world where fire was not a tool but a presence, demanding respect, labor, and meaning. The medieval hearth was survival for peasants, spectacle for nobles, discipline for monks, and community for townsfolk. It was shaped by scarcity and abundance, law and faith, continuity and change. To cook without modern kitchens was to live in constant dialogue with fire, coaxing it, fearing it, mastering it. In this way, medieval cooking reveals more than recipes or tools. It shows us how people understood life itself, precarious, communal, sacred, and symbolic. The hearth was not only where food was made, it was where meaning was made.